Oh dear, here we are yet again. Welcome to the uncolored thing that I'm doing here. I'm Kevin Metcalf, and I apologize first of all for the. There's been a bit of a hiatus. My wife and I have relocated yet again, chased out of another town, and so we're still, as you can see, getting settled, and a lot of stuff that I know I put them in boxes. I just can't seem to find them yet, and it might be days or weeks before I find them again. So I figured I just kind of rig this little thing up here in the living room and, kind of go from there. So I apologize for the delay, but we're going to get right back on this topic. The last thing we did was I was going over this book, one of my favorite books called How Reason Can Lead to God, by a wonderful philosopher. His name is Dr. Joshua, the rugged looking, look at that guy, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen there. And what we were doing was going through the book because he makes an incredible argument regarding just existence in general. It's a very, I guess, is it an existential argument? I don't know. Fascinating argument and really challenges the way you look at things. At least it did for me, as I mentioned in the first video that I did about this. But what's cool about Joshua Rasmussen is that, as I said before, he seems to be somebody who is looking for what ultimate reality looks like. And he's somebody who seems to come at it without any, I shouldn't say without, who seems to be able to take whatever preconceptions that he has, whatever presumptions that he has, that we all have, and not let those get in the way of him figuring out what's going on. And he has some, I don't want to say they're radical. I shouldn't say they're radical. They're new to me. At least it's the first time that I've ever heard them. But I love that he presents them in this very honest and courageous way that he's like, whatever true is, that's where I'm going. And very few people are like that. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons that I started this whole thing was because, you get information from all different quarters. And sometimes what you're hearing is not true. Or at least when you turn on the TV, when you're hanging out with your friends, when you go to work and they say, hey, we're doing a new, I don't know, sensitivity training class or whatever it is, and you're finding out there's a new set of victims that you never even knew about. That you're supposed to be mad at a different group of people now because they've oppressed other people. The thing is that either what people are telling you is true or it isn't true. I don't think there's a third possibility. And when I say true, this is what I'm talking about. That there's some sort of reality that we're all dealing with. And that reality is what I call objective. And what I mean is that it really doesn't depend on what you think about it. It's out there, right? If that table is sitting in front of you and if you walk into it, you're going to hurt your leg. It doesn't matter what you think about it. It's an objective reality out there. And so when people are telling you about this objective world, the things they're saying, they're either true, meaning they accurately map this world out there, or it's not true, which means it's an inaccurate model of this objective world. That's how it seems. And so the question is, what do you do about that? Well, you can just go, well, everybody knows the truth, right? The truth is relative, gang, which again, I don't think anybody really believes that truth is relative. We'll get into that another time. But you can take that tact. Well, their truth is their truth, and your truth is your truth, and on and on. I think that's nonsense. Or you can be what I call in the middle guy, right? And the middle guy says, well, there's a little bit of truth over here, and there's truth over there, but the real truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe, but oftentimes I don't think that that's the case. I think the truth is on one side or the other. And I think it takes a little bit of courage to go there and find it. And I think oftentimes middle guy just doesn't want to deal with it. He wants to be friends with everybody. Again, everybody can do what they want to do, but I don't know that that's the best way to accurately model reality. That's how it seems to me. But I think the best thing to do is that you really got to dig for the truth. And you have to be courageous. But you don't have to be courageous necessarily with what's out there. You have to be courageous with what's in here. Meaning, there's some things that you're going to have to give up eventually. There's some ideas about what you think are true that eventually, if you're really looking hard enough, I think you might have to give up. Because the other idea, the other possibility is the way you understand the world is perfect, error-free, right? Everything you think about reality is actually the way it is, and you're the one who's figured everything out. That might be possible, although I think what's more likely is there's probably some things that you believe that aren't true. And so the question is how you find out. Well, I think there's two kinds of people. As I said, there's people like Joshua Rasmussen, who I think are folks who are trying to find some accurate model of objective reality. And usually I think a way to characterize that accurate model will be called a worldview, just the way you understand the world. You could think of that as this model you have that you believe, more or less, accurately maps what the world is really like. Okay. But then there's another person who I think is not necessarily looking for an accurate model. I think that what they're trying to do is protect their model, whatever model that they've built. It's been given to them by their parents, or it's something that they've gotten from the circle of friends that they like to hang around, or their life experience has given them a particular model of reality. And rather than test that reality against objective reality, or check that model against objective reality, I think what they're trying to do is protect their worldview, their model, against objective reality. So inevitably what will happen is there'll be challenges. Their worldview will be challenged either by objective reality itself, or somebody will go, that's not how it works. And then you've got a couple of options. You can try and figure out, maybe this person is telling you something that makes sense, and you need to hear what they're saying so you can have an accurate model, or you can simply reject, defend, attack, do all the things that, unfortunately, I think a lot of us do, and I got to include myself, because we don't want to know what's really going on. We just like our worldview, and we want to stick with that. So the reason why I picked out Joshua Rasmussen is that he's somebody who, in my opinion, is very good at investigating reality out there and picking out good ideas over bad ideas. Now, here's something that I think may or may not be true, but this is how it seems to me. I think good ideas have a particular characteristic, and I think bad ideas have a particular characteristic. And if your worldview is made up of good ideas, I think as a whole, your worldview might take on the characteristics of good ideas, as opposed to a worldview that has a lot of bad ideas into it, and then you begin to represent those bad ideas. And this is one of the things that I think. I think good ideas are usually pretty simple. And what I mean is, they're not very complicated. It doesn't mean that they can't be complex at a particular level or have very far-reaching ramifications. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that they're usually pretty simple. They're very relatable. You can explain it to somebody and they go, okay, I see what you're saying. It's relatable to life experience oftentimes. You say, well, this thing that I'm talking about, it's kind of like, how yesterday when you're doing such and such, or the way you act with your kids or those kinds of things. And you'd go, oh, okay, I get it. Usually good ideas are like that. Pretty simple. Bad ideas, very complex. And what I mean is, they're very difficult to communicate oftentimes. And they're problematic insofar as there's a lot of what you would call logical inconsistencies, logical contradictions. And because of that, it's very difficult to relate to your own personal everyday experience. And oftentimes people will go, well, this is how it is. And you go, well, geez, that's not how it is in my normal life. Or I've never really experienced that, or I know anybody experienced like that. But they'll try and tell you that that's the way it is anyway. And usually it'll come down to something like, you don't understand, the idea. You're just not smart enough to really understand the idea. A lot of times that's how it comes out. Well, oftentimes that's not really the case. It's not that you're too dumb to understand it. Usually you're talking about a bad idea. Now, I'm not talking about like something like Schrodinger's equation. Listen, I don't understand that. But here's what I know. I know that the principles that that Schrodinger's equation rests upon are probably the same kind of principles that I learned in basic math. They're just more complex. But that's probably pretty simple if you understand some of the complexities. As a matter of fact, a lot of people say that's one of the best equations out there, one of the most beautiful equations. And I think oftentimes when scientists talk about beauty in an equation or a concept or a theory, they're talking about it's a pretty simple one. And as I said, bad ideas, usually complex, fraught with inconsistencies, and oftentimes they'll cover up those inconsistencies in a couple of ways. One, like I said, they'll say, well, you're just not smart enough to figure it out. Sometimes they're really just talking about it's a bad idea, and they don't know how to explain it properly because it's so complex and fraught with a lot of inconsistencies and logical contradictions that you keep pointing out. Another way they combat it is to the bad idea, the person who has the bad idea, they'll bring up a lot of new terminology, right? There's all these new terms and words that they just made up specifically to cover up a bad idea. And I'm going to use an example, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I really don't, because there's a lot of wonderful people that I think have this idea. But I find Calvinism is a lot like that. Calvinism has a lot of terms in it that were made up specifically by Calvinists to explain their idea. And as I understand it, and listen, understand this, I'm the least credible person on any of these issues. It just seems to me that there's a lot of contradictions there. And so they bring up words like synergism and monergism, and there's a ton of different ideas that they develop whole doctrines on, and they just made them up. And I think that, to me, that's a sign of a bad idea, when you have to create a whole bunch of other ideas to come up with a second idea. Another example of that, I think, is the multiverse. I think the multiverse is something that certain scientists have come up with to avoid what seems to be an inexorable conclusion that the universe was created by a powerful being. That's how it seems. And that goes into the Kalam cosmological argument. We'll get into that in another time. But I think when scientists have now, they've given up the oscillating universe, clearly it seems that an infinite universe is impossible. So now they've gone to a multiverse, which there's no scientific evidence for. It's purely just kind of in my opinion, science fantasy. But I think that that's an example. You have to come up with some other thing to explain what I think is a bad idea. Another thing that happens a lot of times is I think that sometimes people will change the name of their idea, oftentimes, when they have a bad idea. Again, Darwin came out with, I think it's like 150, a little bit more ago, with this origin of the species. And unfortunately, listen, it's not necessarily his fault, but they didn't know what was in a cell at the time. And so they just thought this cell was just sort of amorphous bit of plasma, where it could turn into pretty much whatever it wanted to turn into. And so that's how this idea of evolution came about. Well, when people started figuring out DNA, that became a problem. And so they moved from Darwinism to neo-Darwinism to incorporate this new gene stuff. Well, now apparently that's being problematic. And now they're into this new third way of what they call the new synthesis, I think it's called. But the problem is when you ask, well, can you explain it to me? Turns out it's just Darwinism again. It's really the same idea. It's just a bad idea, because it seems to me any investigation into biology always ends at the beginning, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but you can't figure out how it all started. That's usually the problem. Origins is a big problem with many materialist philosophies and theories. And so oftentimes to cover up those problems, they simply change the name of it as they go on, because they know as Darwinism really isn't a very good idea anymore, or it has problems. Then they move to neo-Darwinism, and then that turns into the third wave, and I think there's even another one coming up. But oftentimes bad ideas, you got to keep changing the name of it. But it's really just the same idea with a new name. Calvinism does the same thing. Calvinism, again, many people find problematic because of the conclusions or the what it says about God. And so it went from Calvinism, I hear a lot of people call it Reformed theology. They're talking about the great reformers and during the whole Catholic thing, I don't know, the 1600s. But the problem with that is that there are many people who are reformers who, you know, were part of that Reformed thing who think Calvinism is nonsense. So, but the taking on of the Reformed theology idea, I think, seems to me an attempt to get away from the idea of Calvinism, which again is a problematic idea. And now there's even a new thing called, what do they call? Oh, the doctrines of grace. Okay, it's a very lofty name they put on it. But it's not Calvinism anymore. It's the doctrines of grace. Again, I don't know why you would change the name unless you think that Calvinism, there's something wrong with it. But in my opinion, oftentimes, and this is just generally, bad ideas, you'll hear the name change a lot. Socialism used to be socialism, then it turned into democratic socialism, right? And then now some people call it what do they call it? State capitalism. Right. You get away from the whole socialism name altogether by calling it state cap. It's the same thing. When you explain the idea, what are you talking about? Yeah, it sounds like socialism to me, right? The whole doctrines of grace, when you explain them, turns out it's just Calvinism again. And so oftentimes it seems to me that bad ideas, you'll find over time, people start changing the name to disassociate it with the negative implications of the original idea. That's how it seems to me. But again, this is just, what do I know? Okay, so we're going to get into Joshua Rasmussen's book. I apologize for that preamble, but again, I'm covering up for a couple of weeks here where I've got some things I'm trying to shoehorn in there. So we're going to get to Joshua Rasmussen's book. And one of the things that he talks about, the tool that he uses is logic and reason. Now, for me, one of the ideas that I go by is if something isn't logical and reasonable, it's probably a bad idea. You know, when it comes to the Bible, I say if it ain't logical, it ain't biblical. I think that one of the ways that God expresses his sovereignty is through logic and reason. It's like the out of bounds lines at a football game or a basketball game. When somebody steps on the line, they're out of bounds. And you don't have to worry what happens after that. You got to stay in bounds. And I think logic and reason are the bounds and the yard markers of the football field, right? It's the out of bounds line on the basketball court. That's how logic and reason seems to me. And if people step out of bounds, then I don't follow them. I don't go down the rabbit hole. And oftentimes bad ideas will have logical inconsistencies. And I think we'll get to this later on where Dr. Rasmussen talks about the differences between a logical inconsistency and then what's called a mystery. Because again, sometimes, especially in theology, when you find these logical inconsistencies in some of these ideas that people put out there, they tell you, well, it's just a mystery of God and you can't, really understand it. And oftentimes it's not a mystery, it's just wrong. So let's look at what Dr. Rasmussen says about logic and reason. Let me find the place in the book here. Here he goes. The power of reason. So it says, just as a grasshopper, I got so many different colors. I confuse myself with the dolly. I got blue and I got pink and then I got orange. And I'm not quite sure why I do each one, but I'll have to figure out a system so I don't confuse myself. Anyway, just as a grasshopper cannot fathom the nature of a tree, we cannot hope to fathom the nature of ultimate reality. This worry invites intellectual humility. Now, there's 2 points there that I think that are important to draw out. The first is that what I think he's clearly saying is that there's no possible way you could know everything about objective reality. There's no possible way. Too many things to know. You'd have to have an infinite mind, and only God has that. So you have to settle with knowing just some things. But the important thing about this, and this is one of the principles that I like about Joshua Rasmussen, is that idea alone should make you be a little bit more humble and less dogmatic about your ideas, about the things that you say are true. And again, I talk to a lot of folks, friends who are wonderful people, but they'll come out on an issue, man, and it's the way it is, and there's no possible way it could be any other way. And you have to understand that what you're saying, when you're so dogmatic about something, and this is why in my 3 principles, what is it? The first one is being honest, upfront, no hidden agenda. The second one is, how do you deal with the challenges? Do you represent the challenges accurately and steelman your challenges? But the third one is humility, or at least the opposite of humility is not being dogmatic. And that's what I think Dr. Rasmussen is pointing here is that just the fact that you can't know everything. As a matter of fact, what you don't know could be infinitely more than what you actually do know. And so that should cause you to be humble. Now, being humble, in my opinion, isn't just, some sort of a, false sense of self-deprecation. I think it's a realization that there's perfect knowledge, which you'll never have, and then there's a little knowledge that you have. And it may be more than anybody else you know, but it's still not perfect. And so that alone should keep you from being so dogmatic as to saying that this is the way it is, and anyone who disagrees with me is wrong, because there are very few, I shouldn't say there's very few, but there are a lot of things that people are dogmatic about that just simply don't have the evidence to support. As a matter of fact, you have people who are just as smart, if not smarter on another side of an issue, who see it differently. And it seems like that alone should make you say, not that you're not right or that you don't have an opinion, but at the very least, you should be able to go, look, this is how it looks to me. But, there are smart people who see it differently. So, this is just what I think about it. And this is the data why I think it. I think that that's humility. Dogma, to me, is the lack of humility. Dogma says that this is the way it is. And if you disagree with me, then you're wrong because you disagree with me, not because you have better points or not. And unfortunately, a lot of people fall into that category. And I imagine I slide into there myself too sometimes. But I think that's something that you have to be aware of. And I think Dr. Rasmussen expertly draws that point out right there. So he goes on to say, let me get to the right. There we go. He goes on to say, while humility will serve us, I want to draw attention to something special and rarely recognize powers of reason. The initial principles about the blob of everything illustrate that reason has at least some power to reveal some far-reaching things. Reason is a light that shines far beyond our local planet. Perhaps you've no idea what exists beyond the Andromeda galaxy, yet reason reveals something. With this in hand, you can see that there are no square circles floating in deep space. Again, I think he makes the point, an expert point. This is, I think, goes against the idea that you really can't have knowledge. And some people will say that. Skeptics will say, there's no way to know anything about anything. And I think that that's totally untrue. Just through logic alone, even in those areas where, again, the Andromeda galaxy, you can know that there's no such thing as a square circle. Why? Because that's out of bounds. It doesn't conform to logic and reason, so you don't even have to chase that idea. It steps right out of bounds. And I think that's an excellent point to make. Because again, some people will tell you, well, you just can't know, who really knows what's going on? There's some things you can know using logic and reason. Logic is like a telescope that lets you see something about everything, everywhere. For example, you can see that no contradictions exist on any planet. No matter how far you travel, you'll never find a place where something is both true and not true. You might find a green alien, but you'll never find a green alien that is simultaneously not green at all. From Earth, then you can see that all regions of space are free from square circles, forceless forces, and colorless green aliens. Reason has another special power. Reason not only has the power to reveal something about everything, it also has the power to reveal some things crystal clearly. Crystal clearly. And every time I read that, I think that's wrong, but he wrote the book. I'm sure he's right. Consider, for example, back to the right thing. Consider, for example, the hypothesis that no square circles exist on Jupiter. You can see the truth of this beyond Beyond, oh, you can see the truth of this hypothesis clearly by the light of reason. You do not need to check the soil on Jupiter or trust anyone's report. Rather, the light of reason gives you a way to see with crystal clarity that Jupiter's soil has no square circles buried underneath. There is no chance of that. Again, it seems like when you're trying to figure out what things are true and what things are not true, that line, that boundary line, like the football field or the basketball field, of logic and reason will tell you, I don't have to chase that. Somebody tells you something and it goes outside of that bounds, then you don't have to worry about what they're telling you after that, because it contradicts logic and reason. There's some problem there. And unless they can overcome that problem, just let it go out of bounds, blow the whistle, and then go to another play. Here we go. He says, I'm not saying we cannot make mistakes in reasoning. Obviously we can. Mistakes are common. We can misuse reason. We can misuse reason. With reason in hand, we risk rationalizing falsehoods. Well, we'll get into that again. But oftentimes people can misuse reason and misuse logic. And those are logical fallacies that we'll talk about later. And I'm not going to talk about it in the smart way. I found a really cool book. It's like a cartoon book. I was just reading it last night. I popped over it again. But it goes over a whole bunch of logical fallacies. And it's my level because it's got a lot of cartoons in it. But I think it clearly illustrates the way people misuse reason to come to false ideas. And I think that's what Dr. Rasmussen is talking about there. It says the key to minimizing error is intellectual humility. Again, going back to the idea, recognizing that, listen, I don't know everything. There's information that I don't have. People who are smart or as smart or smarter than me who may understand things differently, and I should try and learn from them rather than attack those people. The problem is not is not with reason per se, but how we use it. Instead of using reason to rationalize a worldview, we can use reason to aim for truth. And again, I have to point out, when you're talking to people, theology, politics, any issue, oftentimes people will try to use reason to justify a bad position. And it's tough to look for that. You have to practice looking for logical fallacies that they use to push bad ideas. Where do we go? We can also minimize error by combining reason with other evidence. For example, with reason, we can test a theory's logical consistency and then draw out implications. We can go on to test the implications by making further observations. In this way, we can combine reason with experience to make our path more secure. The implications of an idea are very important. Oftentimes, people will come up with ideas and not really see the implications of that idea. And again, and I hate bringing it up, but Calvinism seems such a big idea with Calvinism. The implications of Calvinism say such horrible things about who God is. And the cover up for that is, well, it's a mystery, or how can you question God? And that's arguing in the circle, because it's presupposing that God does these horrible things that Calvinism claims it does. And that's really the question. Does God really do those things? But they don't answer that. They simply say either A, you can't question it, or B, it's a mystery, parallel lines that meet in eternity, and which is dumb because, parallel lines don't meet, because that's why they call them parallel lines. But again, my point is, the implications of an idea, in my opinion, are as important as the idea itself. Because while the idea may sound cool, when you start to look at the implications of the idea and you come to all these logical contradictions, then that probably means that your original idea is bad. But rather than going back and going, well, we're going to have to trash that original idea because the implications just are insane, they simply start trying to cover up those conclusions or the implications. And again, that's where all this new terminology comes up, the synergism, the monergism, the idea that, well, you just don't understand the idea properly because you're having all these problems with it. And oftentimes that's really not the case. It's that the implications of your idea are so crazy that it's probably a bad idea. That's what that should indicate to you oftentimes. But, that doesn't really happen enough. Oh, here we go. All right. Okay, as we continue on the journey, we're going to seek to separate the clear from the unclear. For example, empirical science sometimes uses paradoxes. Now, this is the point that I wanted to talk to, especially dealing with, again, this idea of, I shouldn't just pick on Calvinism, because there's a lot of bad ideas in theology. But there are some things that from the Bible that are very clear. Okay. There are some things that just aren't that clear. Okay. In my opinion, if you're building some ideology based on something in the Bible that just really isn't that clear, when very brilliant people can look and go, well, if you look at it this way, you don't have those problems, right? Not saying they're right and you're wrong, just saying that there's other ways to look at it that don't have these negative implications. Oftentimes, the answer you're going to get is, well, it's just a paradox. It's just a mystery. And you just have to accept the mystery. And if you don't accept the mystery, you have to, all that nonsense. Oftentimes, that's just not the case. Oftentimes, it's just a bad idea and it's wrong. And so it's necessary to make that clear so you don't propagate ideas that are bad. You got to look at the implications. Second. I'm going to do this. All right, ready back again. And so finally he gets to this part here where he says, however, we can separate observations that are paradoxical from observations that contradict reason. It may be paradoxical how space could curve, but it's not contradictory. A paradox is something that we do not see how to put together, whereas a contradiction is something we do see cannot go together. That is such a key thing there. That is so key. Just like I mentioned, oftentimes, not just in theology, society's got all these nutty ideas. Karl Marx will never die. Because the dumb ideas just keep coming back. And when you point out the problems with it, oftentimes, paradox, mystery, those are the kind of ideas that come up. And again, I think mystery talks about things that are simply beyond our knowledge horizon. We just don't see how it works. But when you can see something that it just cannot work together, that's not a mystery. It's not a paradox, right? When you have 100, years of history, and you have a whole century that says Marxism is a bad idea, socialism it's country cancer, and you have documented historical data for 100 years that show you that socialism just kills countries, yet people still want to do it. Well, that's a mystery why people still want to do it. I don't know how that works. But the idea that socialism is a good idea contradicts historical reality. It's a contradiction, right? There's a lot of ideas that simply contradict objective reality, and you got to acknowledge that. And people who don't want to give those things up, again, they don't care about the truth. They seem to be holding on to a worldview rather than trying to figure out what reality is about. And I know when Joshua wrote this book, he's not trying to get into politics or anything like that. Those are the implications that some of the things that come up when I'm talking about it. So don't conflate my comments to anything that Joshua Rasmussen is saying. He's just simply pointing out. But what I think he's doing is pointing out what I think are such essential bottom level foundational truths. I think when a truth is so foundational, it does have wide implications over such a large area, which is why I think the book's so fantastic. So that's mostly what I wanted to get to today, is the idea that there's two ways you can, well, there's a couple of ways you can go about understanding the world and going through the world. And we all do it. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this thing is that, look, it's not complicated. Good ideas are usually simple. And if a knucklehead like me can grasp some of these ideas, then really anybody can. I'm the bottom rung of the ladder, if that. So if I can do this, anybody can do this. And I'm not talking about what I'm doing here. I'm simply saying that when you go to the store, when you go to work, when you relate to your family, everything you're doing, these things are at play. One of the things that somebody told me is that, you're always training and you're always learning. You're either learning good things or you're learning bad things. And I'm simply saying that there are tools you can use to figure out which one of the things that you're learning. If you're sitting in front of the news every day, which I think is the worst idea you can do, you're probably hearing a lot of BS. There's tons of BS and nonsense going on the news. Even SportsCenter. I didn't even watch SportsCenter. I used to wake up and go to sleep to SportsCenter back in the 80s and 90s. I never watch it anymore. Why? BS and nonsense. It's full of that. And I'm simply saying that if you're going to be a responsible adult, you should start to figure out what are the things that I'm hearing from my coworkers, from my family, from the TV, from movies, Twitter, social media. What are the things that are true, and what are the things that aren't true? That's really what this is all about. So next week we're going to go into a little bit more of the book. I've gone on way too long. I've got more notes here, but I talk too much. That's the problem. But thanks for listening. And again, pick up Joshua Rasmussen's book, How Reason Can Lead to God. A fantastic book, eminently readable. Knucklehead like me can read it. Go to his website. It's joshualrasmussen.com, I think it is. Fantastic website. He's got his YouTube channel, Worldview Design. I'm on it regularly and watching the same videos I've been watching before. He's got new stuff over there, but again, I'm trying to grasp some of the ideas on there. Again, not that they're complex, they're just deep. So go to the website, go to his YouTube channel, and get the book, How Reason Can Lead to God. Do me a favor, subscribe, like, and all those other things, and please make comments. And I apologize again for the hiatus, but we'll have this mess cleared up pretty soon. And hopefully I'll get my office set up again. Hopefully I will get my office set up again pretty soon, so I can go back in there, because this is not conducive. It's too hot right here. But again, thanks again. Thanks for taking a look. And again, any comments you have, I appreciate it. This is an Uncolored podcast, or the thing that I'm doing, and I'll see you next time. All right, that's enough. I'm out of here. I gotta do that.